Hi, welcome to a new Bible study. Bible study is going to be focused on the call of Abraham and how the God of Abraham got to Moses. Now, I've added something new for Bible study, and that's right here in the back. That, my friends, is St. Gregory, or as I know him, Greg. If you're familiar with Gregorian chants, he's the reason. He's also the patron saint of students and studying, and I'm going to call him the patron saint of Bible study. And he's sitting over my shoulder, keeping an eye on what I do and say. All right, we're going to talk about Abraham first. Abraham is an interesting character in Scripture. What we know about Abraham comes from several sources. There are some historical sources, but if we look at the Bible alone, we remember that there were three different major sources of authorship of the Pentateuch. There was the Yahwist, who wrote primarily for the northern kingdom, the Elohist, who wrote primarily for the southern kingdom, and the priestly writings, who kind of served in the temple and geared things towards the temple. So all three of these authors have different ways of describing events in Scripture. That's why there are a lot of duplicates on stories. So what we know of Abraham is kind of a conglomeration of all of those stories. We know that Abraham was born in the place called Ur. And that's on, there is Ur. Now, Ur is down here. And this is where Abraham was born. You can see that that's over in the Chaldean territory, south of Babylon. And Abraham was called from Ur, with his family, to Haran, which is located up here. Now, this area is known as the Fertile Crescent. You see this area in here from Mesopotamia, Assyria, Phoenicia, and lower and upper Egypt. This was the Fertile Crescent, and it was called that because it was very fertile land. Things grew well, primarily because this was an area located along the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers on the eastern part, and on the western side, the Nile River. And it was bordered on the west by the eastern Mediterranean Sea. This was a very prosperous area because a lot of crops were grown there. And so we have the story, and we don't know for sure, was Abraham alone called to go from Ur to Haran, or had his father move the family to Haran? We really don't know for sure. There are different beliefs on that. But we know that God called him from Haran down into this area here, which is the land of Canaan. Now, God had a wonderful relationship with Abraham because Abraham was faithful. When Abraham went into a covenant with God, he circumcised himself to show his faith. Now, to me, that's a heck of a mark of faith to do that to yourself. But that's where the whole concept of circumcision began for the Jews. That was part of the covenant. Abram was initially known as Abram, which means exalted father. But in Genesis chapter 17, verses 4 to 5, God said that because of his faith, he was going to change his name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of many. So this makes Abraham one of the few characters in Scripture who went by two different names. His name changed when his conversion occurred. And I might mention that when Paul's version occurred, his name went from Saul to Paul. So having that conversion changed not only the person but their name. And this is important because for the Jews, when you knew the name of something, you possessed it in a very unique way. For example, they never referred to God as Yahweh, because to say God's name meant you had power over God. So when Abram was changed from Abram to Abraham, it showed a conversion not only of the person, but of the whole being. Later in Genesis 17, verses 15 to 16, Abraham's wife, whose name was Sarah, was changed from Sarai, meaning my princess, to Sarah, meaning mother of nations. So here we had the father of many and the mother of nations, husband and wife, but they were childless. And so Sarah gave to Abraham her servant, Hagar. And Abraham had a child with Hagar, whose name was Ishmael. And interestingly enough, it's through this relationship that that Islam, the Muslims, trace their heritage back to Abraham. It goes through Hagar. Now, Sarah was concerned because she was barren, but because of her faith, God said, you'll have children. And Abraham and Sarah both said, hey, we're old folks. How are we going to have children? And God said, no problem. Trust me, you will have a child. Well, the light went out. We're going to keep on going. So Abraham and Sarah had a child, and his name was Isaac. Now, it's interesting, that Abraham had this promise from God of land, Canaan, of descendants. Now he had Isaac as well as Ishmael by a servant, and the blessings that God would provide. And certainly he felt blessed by these gifts from God. So what do we do then? How do we deal with the fact that Abraham, although he traveled from these places and even eventually ended up going to Egypt, how does the God, Yahweh, get from the promised land to Moses? Well, we're going to pop up here. This is a picture of the Sinai Peninsula. Where did Moses go to find God? Well, he went to the land of Midian. And in the land of Midian, he served as the helper of a man named Jethro, who was the priest of Midian. And he married Jethro's daughter. Now, how did Moses, down here, somewhere along this Gulf of Arabia and on the Sinai Peninsula, how did God get there from Canaan, or the Fertile Crescent, that land that he first came to Abraham in? Well, it was no different back then than it was today. Every community is filled with a lot of different churches, a lot of different denominations, and everyone having their own interpretation of God. And not only do we have Christian denominations, but we have other things who feel they have a relationship with God. People who are involved in Wicca, or people who are involved in whatever. It was no different back in the time of Abraham and Moses. Every area had their own God. People find a God that they can relate to, that will help them understand these great questions of life. So how did that God Yahweh end up on the Sinai Peninsula? Well, after Sarah died, Abraham married another woman named Keturah. Now there are some who believe that Keturah may have been Hagar with a different name. There's no proof one way or the other, but there is a belief that it could have been Hagar. But we know that Keturah did bear 6 sons for Abraham: Zimran, Jokashan, Medan, Midian, Ishbar, and Shua. That's listed in 25th chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 4. Now you notice one of those names was Midian. And Jethro was a priest of Midian. So if they were offsprings of Abraham, they certainly would have known about the God Yahweh. And so when Moses goes to that Sinai Peninsula, and on top of that mountain encounters that burning bush, and he asks, "Who should I tell the people sent me to lead them from captivity into freedom?" The voice came from that bush, said, "Tell them I am who I am, the God Yahweh." So that's an example or an illustration or explanation on how the God Yahweh traveled from Canaan, how he had encountered Abraham in a completely different area, and yet was discovered by Moses in a completely different location, down in Egypt, on the Sinai Peninsula. It comes through one of the 6 sons of Keturah, Midian. So I hope that little explanation helps you in coming to grasp with some of the biblical concepts. Share with me your feelings, and if you have any suggestions for future Bible studies, please do not hesitate to give me a call, a message, an email. I will be more than happy to look at what we can do to fill the gap for the Bible studies that we're missing. Thank you. And Greg and I both say goodbye.